Spoilers ahead, so live action onlys beware. The live action was a success. It broke records, it broke the curse, and it's already been renewed for a second season. Luffy just defeated Kaido in the anime, concluding what's, in my opinion, the greatest fight in the series, and it was given some of the best animation you'll ever see. And the manga just keeps ramping up with each chapter, with some of the most hype moments the series has ever seen. I'm going to discuss why One Piece is one of the most popular manga series of all time, and why it's so highly praised by millions upon millions of people. There'll be 3 dedicated sections, one for the manga, one for the anime, and one for the live action. The manga section will speak on the biggest selling points of the story. The anime section will discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly of how the anime adapted the manga. And the live action section will discuss how Netflix successfully molded the story to appeal to the rest of the world. The manga began in July 1997, which means it's 7 years older than me. So to put this into perspective, Bill Clinton was still the president, Princess Diana was still alive, Jurassic Park 2 was just released, the first Harry Potter book was only just published, South Park wasn't a thing, and Mother Teresa was still alive. So more than 26 years later, it's still here and stronger than ever. So obviously the first thing you notice about the manga is the sheer size of the story. 1093 chapters and counting at the time I'm writing this. People who refuse to get into the series will say because of its length, calling it the series' greatest drawback. But just like other long-running series, once you get into it, the length soon becomes its greatest strength. You ever hear people complain about how they want more out of something? Well, One Piece has taken that and taken it to a whole nother level. That's the perfect series for them, since the scope of it is wild. And I will say, however, the length being an issue does make sense. I'm not saying that's an invalid point, that's perfectly reasonable. Speaking of the scope of the series, one thing that One Piece undoubtedly does better than any other series is world building. Of course, across 1000 plus chapters, the number of unique and fascinating characters, locations, and mysteries that make up this massive world is beyond measure. Each part of the story is connected. From something introduced in chapter 1, we learn something new about it in chapter 1044. A character can be MIA for hundreds of chapters, and yet the mere mention of their name can make everyone lose their minds. And the main thing that sells the world building is that the world moves forward without the main cast. The best examples of this being the progression of Ace's and Blackbeard's story from Alabasta through to Marineford, as well as the cuts to the outside world in between the acts of Wano. The world is really alive and everything stays in motion, even when we are not present. Any event in this story can go on to cause huge ripple effects that will be felt hundreds of chapters later. For example, Crocodile's exploits in Alabasta, then moving forward to Doflamingo's exploits in Dressrosa, and learning about Fujitora's goal of disbanding the warlords. Then move forward to the Reverie, where we see the rulers of those 2 kingdoms, Cobra and Rikudoldo, advocating for that same goal, and then finally the abolition of the 7 warlords.
It's all connected, man!
Next, I'll talk about the characters, and I'll start with the designs. They are wacky and they are wild. You will see some of the coldest character designs in this story, some of the most unique character designs in this story, and everything in between. For example, the biggest villains in One Piece look like this, and this. So you can see the variety in the shapes and sizes. These strange character designs are another thing that puts people off when trying to get into the story. But again, it's something that turns into a massive plus, and it's a staple of the story. Weird designs are just the norm. Onto the characters themselves, you will find every character trope ever created in the world of One Piece. You've got the classics, the giants, the dwarves, the fishmen, animal-human hybrids, and then you got the badass old guys, the rivals, and so on. There's a character for everyone. Now let's focus on the main cast, the Straw Hats. Each member of the crew has their own role that stops them from being overshadowed by each other. Having a unique role that no one else can fulfill instantly makes them indispensable, even in the grand scheme of the story. And they don't have tragic backstories just for the sake of tragic backstories. Each of their flashbacks plays big parts in the way they act in the present story. For example, Nami's trauma at Along Park resurfaces every time she comes into contact with the fishmen, like Jinbei and at Fishman Island. We see the way that she treats children with tremendous care, such as the kids at Punk Hazard and Tama in Wano, because of the effect that Belmare, her adoptive mother, had on her. This sort of thing can be seen with each member of the crew. Next will be how it balances its fun and dark undertones. On face value, One Piece is fun, light-hearted, it's a big adventure about a group of friends wanting to achieve their dreams, but each arc has some very heavy themes driving it forward. One of the biggest complaints in modern media, especially in the West, is the cancel culture, the woke side of things. Stories being too politically driven, which inevitably ruins the story. And I agree with those complaints. But when Oda chooses to touch upon some very real issues in the series, significantly adds to the story rather than taking away from it. The biggest example being the discrimination between the fishmen and the humans. It doesn't talk about race for the sake of being inclusive. It's a real struggle. The world government, one of the story's overarching antagonists, is a corrupt organization filled with both good and bad. So to sum it up, it's not all black and white. There's a lot of grey. Now I'm going to be moving on to what the manga is doing right now. So here's your spoiler warning, and skip to this timestamp to avoid it. We are getting some of the best material the series has ever seen, because the manga has entered the final saga, which sounds scary because it means we are a step closer to the end, but there's a lot that the story still needs to get through, and what we've seen so far is really hype. The current arc is called the Egghead arc, named after the island it's taking place on, just like every other arc. But let's be honest, this isn't just the Egghead arc. We are cutting to every corner of the world, seeing what every major player is doing, and we're seeing the world move towards the final war. The pieces are being set up, players are making their moves. So just think about this real quick. 2 chapters, 1079 and 1080. There's been a lot of hype chapters and hype moments in this final saga so far, but these 2 chapters I want to hone in on. 2 back-to-back chapters where we see 2 fan favorite characters showcase their power and prove why people love them. Shanks one-shotting one of the most divisive characters in the story in Eustace Kid on Elbaf as well, on Elbaf, the place we all want to go. With the reintroduction of Dory and Broggy the Giants, and then next chapter onto Hachinosu the Pirate Island, we see Kobe, we see the Marines entering, we see the Titanic captains of Blackbeard's crew take action, and we see the hero. Jump in with this. Now that Gear 5 has been animated, you can see why people are jumping over to the manga. You wait for the Gear 5 greatness in the anime, and then witness the greatness in the manga. Because just seeing the entire One Piece community lose their minds at these moments is worth the switch. So for the manga, the original story itself, the length, the world building, the characters and the complexities of the narrative all pieced together to form one piece. Now to the anime, and when we talk about the anime, you have to talk about Wano. Wano in the manga is already amazing. I know it's not perfect, but it's one of my favourite arcs in the entire series. And yet the anime elevates it to some ridiculous heights. It's a weekly anime, don't forget, and it has some of the best animation you will ever see. Kaido versus everyone. Yes, not Luffy versus Kaido, but Kaido versus everyone, since Kaido is the main focus of the battle going against everyone, but that's besides the point. That fight went from one of the best fights in One Piece to one of the best fights in anime in general. And moving away from the animation, the Wano arc has some of the best soundtracks in the whole series, and here's a list of my personal favourites. All of this just makes you wonder what the anime will look like for what's to come. So for the bad and the ugly that I mentioned before, obviously the anime isn't perfect, with the majority of the post-time skip being criticised for its terrible pacing. And to stay weekly and not catch up to the manga, the anime has had to adapt only one chapter per episode at most. Dressrosa is the arc that receives the most criticism for its pacing. Also, since it's a weekly anime, the animation has reflected that in the past. You know, it was basic. But one thing I can say for sure is that the moments that hit hard in the manga will most certainly hit hard in the anime. Throughout the series, the death of the Going Merry, Robin saying she wants to live, Nami asking Luffy to help her, nothing happened, and so on. This isn't something exclusive to One Piece, but one thing that anime will always have over manga is the sound. The atmosphere that can be created by incredible voice acting and soundtracks. So at the end of the day, even with the poor pacing and basic animation that One Piece has suffered through for a lot of its anime run, there are many people who still love those arcs that suffer those issues, like Dressrosa, because as bad as those issues can be, there's still an amazing story to hold it up. Lastly, the live action. A series that was supposedly doomed to fail from the start, it's gonna continue the legacy of terrible live action adaptations of animated series, and it's helmed by Netflix, a declining streaming service with a trash live action record of its own. One Piece is too wacky, it's too over the top, it's the hardest series to adapt into live action, so why even try? It's gonna fail! It broke records and has already been renewed for season 2. During the build-up to the live action, I was on the optimistic side of things rather than the pessimistic side. But that's not to say that the pessimism wasn't justified. The doubts that people had was fair. It hadn't succeeded before, so there's no reason to see why it would succeed now. Oda wants to share One Piece with the world. It's already global, what's the point? We don't need a live action. I can understand the viewpoint of each of those people, but I always thought that it wasn't as simple as that. Oda being directly involved in and holding creative control of the live action is the key that made me and many others so optimistic for the series, but even then there were questions. Oda's a mangaka. Just because he's behind the series doesn't mean that it will work. TV is a completely different form of storytelling, and again, that's a fair point. But what separates Oda from a company like Disney in my eyes was this. Disney is a major corporation who has run out of good ideas and whose sole focus in recent years isn't to make entertainment, but to make money. Meanwhile, Eiichiro Oda is one man who has wrote one story across almost 3 decades. He has put his entire being into this story and it's his life's work. There is no way he would let someone ruin it and take apart what he has created. Of course, this still doesn't guarantee success, but it told me that it wasn't just a shameless cash grab. It was a passion project with the money to back it up. Showrunners Steve Maeda and Matt Owens are massive fans of the series, the cast are massive fans of the series, and leading up to the show's release, I re-watched the trailers multiple times and watched most of the promotional material released with the crew. So I got used to their voices, I got used to their personalities, and most important of all, each of them had real chemistry. It wasn't just a group of people who just happened to be working on the same show. They were a group of friends. Now my thoughts on the show itself. I loved it. It wasn't perfect and it was never going to be perfect, and no one expected it to be perfect. And obviously these are my views as an anime watcher and manga reader. So overall, they were somehow able to reshape the over-the-top nature of the original to fit it into a condensed format, fit for the viewing of a casual and global audience. The cast is extremely likable, and each of them fit their roles better than I could have expected. I mean, I knew I would like Luffy, but to this extent I did not think so. Iñaki Godoy perfectly encapsulates that casual confidence that Luffy has, that isn't arrogance but innocent optimism. The rest of the main cast also do an amazing job in fulfilling their roles, especially Normally Rudd as Nami, who I would say is the best of the bunch. Even the extended cast was amazing. Jeff Ward as Buggy had no right to be as charismatic and entertaining as he was. Mihawk was just ripped straight out of the manga as well. His new introduction in the live action is one of the best character introductions I've seen in a long time. Is it better than the original story? No, of course not. But are there things that I think the live action did that improved upon the original? Surprisingly, yes. And of course there are parts that could have been expanded on more, but overall it was a really good show. I also thought up a very random fan casting for the far future if we ever get there, and I can't get it out of my head. Although I do believe that the castings for future seasons should also be relative unknowns, just like season 1. Jeff Goldblum works way too well as a live action Kizaru in my opinion, and whether he'll still be acting when we get to Sabaody, if we get to Sabaody, that's another story, that's another question. But just look at this, you can't tell me this does not work. So, 2023 was being hyped up as the year of One Piece, and now it all makes sense. Manga, anime, live action. There's nothing like One Piece, and there's nothing currently doing it like One Piece.